At 14 minutes past midnight on July 30th, 1945, Marine Edgar Harrell was asleep in his bunk below the waterline of the USS Indianapolis when the first torpedo hit. The explosion threw him out of the bunk before he was fully awake. The lights went out. The floor was already tilting. He had 12 minutes to reach the surface. He didn't know that yet. Nobody told him. The U.S. Navy had the Indianapolis on paper as a warship in good standing. Experienced crew, mission complete, everything normal. That was the official position in the summer of 1945. She had just finished the most important delivery of the entire war. As far as the Navy was concerned, she was fine. What the Navy did not put in those reports was the fact that no one had noticed she was gone. Of her 1,196 men, around 900 made it into the water alive after she sank. They stayed there for 4 days. Not 4 hours. 4 days. In open ocean. In water full of sharks. In 30-degree heat, without food, without fresh water, without rescue, while the most powerful Navy in history kept running normal operations around them, wrote down no missing ship, and sent no one to look. 879 men died, most of them after the sinking, not from the torpedoes, from waiting. 3 officers received distress calls from the Indianapolis. Not one of them did anything. 1 man would be held responsible for all of it. It would not be the man you expect. To understand how that was possible, you have to start not with the ocean, but with the ship, and the mission she had just completed. Because the way she died had everything to do with what she had just done. The USS Indianapolis was built in 1931, 610 feet long, nearly 10,000 tons, 9 big guns, a crew of 1,200 men, and 14 years of Pacific service behind her. She had carried President Roosevelt across the Atlantic. She had fought at the Aleutians, at Tarawa, at Saipan. In March of 1945, a Japanese kamikaze hit her and killed 9 men, flooded her engine room, and sent her back to the shipyard for repairs. She came back from that. In July of 1945, she got the most important job of her career. Most of the crew had no idea what they were carrying. They were told it was classified cargo, priority equipment, highest level. They were told to lock the crates to the deck and not ask questions. Some men figured it was a new radio system. One sailor said later that the crates were guarded so carefully he thought it was gold. It was not gold. The Indianapolis was carrying the core of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. She delivered it. Crossed the Pacific at full speed, alone, without escort, and put the parts that would end the war into the hands of the team waiting at Tinian Island. She delivered the weapon that ended the war on July 26th. 4 days later, the Navy didn't know where she was. There was a reason she was sailing home without protection. The Navy had a rule. Fast ships don't need escorts, because submarines can't keep up with them. The Indianapolis could do 32 knots. The thinking was, she'll outrun anything out there. But there was something the Navy hadn't fixed before sending her out. The Indianapolis had no working sonar. Her underwater detection equipment had been damaged and not replaced. She was sailing at night, through a stretch of ocean known for Japanese submarines, with no way to hear anything coming from below. That decision was made at command level. It was in the records. Nobody stopped the ship. And in the dark water ahead of her, a Japanese submarine commander named Mochitsura Hashimoto had spent most of July without a single kill. He had fired at one ship and missed. He had spotted another and couldn't close in. He was starting to think about heading back to port. Then his lookouts saw something on the surface. Remember the name Hashimoto? He will come back in this story, in a courtroom in Washington, doing something no one in that room saw coming. Edgar Harrell didn't know any of this. He didn't know about the sonar. He didn't know about Hashimoto. He was a 20-year-old Marine from Owensboro, Kentucky, assigned to the ship's guard unit. He stood watch, cleaned weapons, and wrote letters home. He had been on the Indianapolis for months. He knew the ship. He knew the men around him. On the evening of July 29th, he had dinner in the mess hall, went back to his bunk, and fell asleep. It is worth stopping here for a moment, because what happened in the water only makes sense if you understand what life on the Indianapolis was like before the torpedoes. The ship was in the tropics. Below decks, the temperature rarely dropped below 35 degrees. The ventilation system moved warm, wet air from one compartment to the next. Men slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high, with maybe 30 centimeters between their face and the bunk above them. There was no air conditioning. There was no privacy. 1,200 men in a steel tube in the Pacific heat. The mission made things stranger. Nobody would say where they were going or why. The crates on deck were guarded around the clock by men who didn't speak to anyone. Some sailors walked past those crates every day and never figured out what was inside. There were rumors, a weapon, gold, a new type of engine. The real answer was stranger than any of the guesses. By the time the Indianapolis had delivered her cargo and turned for home, the crew had been running hard for weeks. They had crossed the Pacific in record time. Men were tired. The worst seemed to be over. Officers started to relax a little. Nothing drastic, but the tension that had been there since they left port had started to come down. On the evening of July 29th, the sea was calm. The Indianapolis moved through warm, dark water. Men ate dinner, played cards, wrote letters. A few sat on deck and watched the stars. Edgar Harrell went to his bunk. That was the last normal evening any of them would have. Hashimoto, on board the I-58, had his men ready. He had a clear shot. He fired 6 torpedoes. He fired 6 because he wasn't completely sure of his aim and wanted to make certain at least 1 hit. 2 hit. The first torpedo struck the front of the ship and blew up the ammunition storage below deck. Every man in that section died instantly. The second torpedo hit the middle of the ship, tore open the fuel tanks, and started fires along the hull. The front of the ship was gone. The Indianapolis was taking on 2,000 tons of water per minute, and there was nothing left to stop it. Below decks, men had seconds to understand what was happening. The explosion had knocked out all electrical power. No lights. No intercom. Officers were shouting orders in complete darkness. Men were feeling their way to ladders in a ship that was already leaning to one side and burning. In the forward engine room, the men closest to the second explosion never had a chance. The men further back heard the explosion, felt the ship lurch, and started moving before they fully understood why. Training took over. Get up. Get out. Move toward the hatch. In the sleeping quarters on the port side, men were thrown out of their bunks. Some landed on the floor. Some landed on other men. In the dark, with the ship already leaning, it was impossible to know which way was actually up. Men followed the tilt. The tilt led to the water. Captain Charles McVeigh made it to the bridge, saw the fires and how fast the water was rising, and gave the order to abandon ship. Here is something most people don't know. The order probably never reached most of the crew. The ship's communication system was destroyed in the first few seconds. The abandon ship order passed from person to person, in the dark, on a ship listing 30 degrees and on fire. By the time it reached men in the lower decks, most of them already knew from the angle of the floor that the ship was going down. They didn't need an order. They needed a way out. Some men found exits, some didn't. Some were trapped below and never came up. Some made it to the deck and couldn't find a life jacket in the dark. Some found a jacket, put it on correctly, and made it into the water. Some put it on in the chaos, and it wasn't fastened properly, and the jump knocked it off. There was no order to any of it. 1,200 men and 12 minutes and complete darkness, and a ship that was going down faster than anyone had time to process. Edgar Harrell found a hatch. He climbed. He reached the main deck as the front of the ship was already going underwater. He went over the side. The Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. From 2 torpedo hits to completely gone. Men who had been asleep when the first explosion hit had less than 10 minutes to get up, find their way through total darkness in a tilting, burning ship, and reach the water. Some made it. Many did not. The men who made it hit the water and looked around. The ship was gone. The ocean was dark and warm. They could hear other men nearby but couldn't see them. 3 distress calls had gone out in the last minutes before the ship went down. Or the radio operators believed they had. The emergency power was failing, and nobody knew for sure if the signals had gotten through. What happened to those signals is what killed the men who survived the sinking. Before the 3 signals, you need to understand the system they were sent into. In 1945, the U.S. Navy was moving hundreds of ships a day across the Pacific. Nobody had built a system to check whether each one arrived safely. It would have required staff and communication lines that didn't exist. The Navy had decided, at the top, that it wasn't worth it. And for 4 years of war, that choice hadn't caused a visible problem. It stopped working on July 30th, 1945. The first signal reached a radio operator at the base at Leyte Gulf. He was on night watch. He picked up what he believed was a distress call. He wrote down the time, 12:23 in the morning, and walked over to the duty officer to report it. The duty officer was at his desk. Several people on watch that night said later that he had been drinking. He listened to the report, set down what he was holding, and told the operator to ignore it. Probably interference, he said. Maybe a Japanese trick. The operator went back to his station. He had a direct order. In the Navy in 1945, you didn't go around a superior officer and report him. He logged the contact. He did nothing more. The second signal reached a different officer in the Philippines. He received a partial SOS. He wrote it down, noted the time, 12:31, and filed it in his log. He didn't pass it up the chain. His standing orders said not to forward unconfirmed reports. The entry sat in his log until investigators found it days later. The third signal reached a lieutenant at Tolosa. He decided it was a Japanese fake. That wasn't an unreasonable call. Japanese forces had used false distress signals before to draw Allied planes into traps. His caution was exactly what the war had trained him to have. He was wrong, but the system had built that mistake into him. 3 people, 3 signals, 3 choices. All 3 went the same way. That sequence is worth sitting with for a moment. None of those 3 men were careless. Each one made a decision that made sense inside the rules they were following. And together, those 3 decisions left 900 men floating in open ocean with nobody coming. When the Indianapolis didn't arrive at Leyte Gulf on July 31st, a full day after the sinking, nothing happened. The port logged her as late. Operations continued. 1,196 men, a warship that had just carried the atomic bomb across the Pacific. When she disappeared, the system built to run the world's most powerful fleet produced nothing at all. Edgar Harrell had been in the water for 24 hours by the time the last signal was dismissed. The sharks had been there since dawn. The first night was survivable. Barely. The men were in shock. Many were burned or cut from the explosions. The ones with life jackets were floating. The ones without were treading water or holding on to someone who was. There were life rafts, but not nearly enough for 900 men. The ones who had them pulled others up, hung men off the sides by rope, shared every inch. The ship's doctor, Lewis Haynes, spent the first hours moving between survivor groups. He had nothing, no medicine, no equipment, no supplies at all. What he had was the knowledge of what killed people in open water, and the ability to keep moving when staying still would have meant giving up. Haynes said later that the first death he watched wasn't from sharks or thirst. It was a man with a life jacket, not badly hurt, who simply stopped swimming and went under. He couldn't explain it then. He couldn't explain it 50 years later. He just knew that after he saw it happen, he spent the next 4 days making sure nobody around him got that quiet. The sharks arrived during the night. The sinking had put blood, fuel oil, and food waste into the water. White-tip sharks live in the deep water of the Philippine Sea. They are drawn to anything disturbing the surface. By dawn, on July 30th, they were circling. The attacks started at the edges, men who had drifted away from the groups. Then they came more often as the sharks got used to it. By the second day, they were always there. The men figured it out fast. Splashing attracted them. Stillness was safer. Injured men who couldn't stop moving drew the sharks toward them. The stronger swimmers moved to the center of the group and kept the wounded close. It wasn't perfect. It only worked up to a point. But it was something. And when there is no rescue coming, something is everything. Day 1 ended. Day 2 began. By morning of July 31st, the groups had been in the water for over 12 hours. The sun came up and brought no rescue, but it brought heat. The temperature at the surface in the Philippine Sea in late July sits around 30 degrees. In a life jacket, you can't get out of it. You can't shade yourself. You are in it all day. The men who had head injuries started to deteriorate first. Then the ones who had swallowed fuel oil during the sinking. It coated their throats and made breathing harder. Haynes moved between the groups, checking men, trying to estimate who had hours left and who had days. He had no way to change either number. Survivors described the same thing happening across different groups at the same time on day 2. The men who lasted weren't the ones with the most gear or the best officers. They were the ones who knew each other. Engine room crews, gun crews, repair teams who had worked together for months. They made it through in better numbers than men who had always worked mostly alone. Letting go meant letting go of someone who knew your name. That turned out to matter more than almost anything else. One group had a gunnery officer named Richard Redmayne. He had been burned in the explosion and was in pain the entire time in the water. But he organized his group of about 150 men, with the same precision he used to run a gun crew. He assigned men to positions. He made them give their names and rate out loud so he could track who was there. He made them answer back on a schedule. If a man didn't answer, 2 others would go to him immediately. It was a roll call. In the middle of the Philippine Sea, without a ship or a roster or anything except memory and voice, he ran a roll call every hour. When the rescue ships arrived, his group had held together better than almost any other. The thirst hit hard on day 2. After 24 hours without fresh water, the body starts shutting things down. The thirst stops feeling like discomfort and starts feeling like something breaking. Salt water is right there, everywhere. Every man in the water knew that drinking it would make things worse. It pulls water out of the body faster than it puts any in, and it starts breaking down the kidneys within hours. They knew this. On the 2nd and 3rd day, some of them drank it anyway. The men who drank salt water started seeing things within hours. It followed the same pattern across dozens of accounts. They saw land. They saw ships. They saw a way down into the water where fresh water was stored. They swam toward these things. They left their groups. One survivor described a man who became convinced the Indianapolis was still down there beneath them, just sitting on the bottom, with full water tanks. He dove under 4 times looking for a way in. On his 4th try, he didn't come back up. The men who hadn't touched salt water watched this and could do nothing. Day 3 was the worst. August 1st, 1945. The groups had been in the water for 60 hours. Life jackets were soaking through and sitting lower. Men were slipping below the surface. Some couldn't hold their heads up anymore, and the men beside them had to hold them. Haynes described one moment on day 3 that he carried for the rest of his life. A young sailor, he didn't know the name, had been holding on well for 2 days. On day 3, the boy just looked at Haynes and said, "I can't do this anymore." Haynes talked to him for over an hour. He made the boy count. He made him name things, his hometown, the names of his family, what he was going to eat first when he got home. He made him keep talking, because the moment a man stopped talking was usually close to the moment he stopped floating. Haynes kept him alive until the rescue. Edgar Harrell was still there. He hadn't drunk salt water. He stayed with his group. He prayed. He said this later with no apology and no extra words. He prayed. That's what he did. And he was still above the water on day 3 when most of the men who had gone in with him were not. The officers made a call in the first few hours that wasn't in any rule book. They lied. They told the men rescue was coming. They said the distress calls had gotten through. They said ships were on the way. Hold on. It won't be long. None of them knew if any of that was true. What's remarkable isn't that they lied. It's how long it worked. Men who had enough left to survive 1 more hour kept going because they believed that hour would bring a ship. When no ship came, the officers moved the timeline forward. Tomorrow morning. By tonight. First light. The horizon kept moving. The men kept swimming toward it. A quartermaster named Vincent Allard did something simpler, and in some ways it worked even better. He set up watch rotations, in the water, even with nothing to watch for, even with nothing to do. He split his group into shifts. 2 hours in the water, 2 hours resting against whatever was floating nearby. It barely mattered in practical terms. But having a shift meant there was a next shift. Having a next shift meant there was a point. A 2-hour future, even a completely made-up one, was enough to keep a man going when he might otherwise have stopped. Adrian Marks, one of the first people to reach the survivors, said he had expected to find broken, exhausted men grateful for help. Instead, he found people who had built working routines, watches, group rules, small structures, in conditions that should have made all of that impossible. He also found men so far gone they didn't understand what was happening when the rescue plane landed. Some had to be physically held back from drinking the water around them, even while they were being pulled out of it. 4 days had broken something in the way their bodies were processing the world. The alarm was still going, and the mind couldn't shut it off. The Indianapolis was not found because anyone was looking. On August 2nd, 1945, 4 days and 4 hours after the sinking, a Navy pilot named Wilbur Gwynn was on a routine patrol flight, not searching for survivors, not sent to that area by anyone. He was fixing a wire antenna on the back of his aircraft when he looked out of his cockpit and saw what he first thought was an oil slick from a Japanese submarine. He dropped down to take a closer look. He saw men in the water. His first estimate back to base: 50 survivors. The actual number, once rescue ships arrived, was 316. A pilot named Adrian Marks was flying a large patrol plane nearby when Gwynn's report came through. He turned immediately. When he got over the position and saw how many men were in the water below him and what was happening at the edges of the groups, he made a decision that broke his orders. He landed the plane on the open ocean. The rule against it existed for good reason. Landing a big patrol aircraft in open ocean swells could destroy the plane. Marks landed anyway. He taxied through the survivor groups, pulled men on board, and when the inside was full, he tied men to the wings with rope. He kept going until the plane was so heavy she couldn't fly. Marks and his crew pulled 56 men from the water before the ships arrived. The first rescue ship, the Cecil J. Doyle, arrived around 11:30 that night. Her captain, Graham Claytor, did something simple. He aimed the ship's searchlight straight up into the sky, at the clouds, not the water, so it would be visible for miles in every direction and guide the other ships in. The men in the water saw the light. At first they thought it was lightning. Then they understood what it was. When all the rescue ships had cleared the area, 316 men had been pulled out. The Indianapolis had gone into the water with 1,196 aboard. 880 were gone. This is where Mochitsura Hashimoto comes back. Captain Charles McVeigh was put on trial after the war. The charge: he had put his ship at risk by not ordering a zigzag course, a standard move in waters where submarines operate, where changing direction makes it harder to aim a torpedo. The argument against McVeigh was simple. If the Indianapolis had been zigzagging, the I-58 might not have gotten a clean shot. Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the ship, was brought to Washington to testify. The Navy brought him to testify against McVeigh. He testified for McVeigh. Under oath, in a U.S. Navy courtroom, Hashimoto said zigzagging would not have changed anything. His shot had been clear. The angle, the speed, the distance, it was a straightforward setup. A zigzag might have shifted his aim point. It would not have made him miss. The man who had actually fired the torpedoes said this, under oath, as a witness brought in to testify against the defendant. McVeigh was convicted anyway. American officers who hadn't been in the submarine disagreed with Hashimoto, and the court decided their opinion mattered more than the testimony of the man who had been there. McVeigh was found guilty, reduced in rank, and then immediately let off punishment by the Secretary of the Navy. He stayed in the Navy and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1949. The conviction stayed on his record. After the war, McVeigh started getting letters from the families of men who had died in the water. Letters blaming him for the deaths of their sons, their brothers, their husbands. He got them for years. He answered some. He tried to explain. He tried to carry their grief without agreeing that the three ignored distress calls, the missing ship tracking system, and every other failure that had happened was somehow on him. He couldn't say that honestly. The officer who was drinking when the first distress call came in, no consequences. The officer who filed the second signal and didn't pass it up, no consequences. The lieutenant who decided the third call was a fake, no consequences. The port official whose office had no system for tracking missing ships, no consequences. McVeigh, who had survived 4 days in the water after ordering his crew off the ship, was the one put on trial. On November 6, 1968, Charles McVeigh walked out to the front yard of his house in Litchfield, Connecticut, and shot himself. He was holding a toy sailor in his hand. He was 70 years old. Here is how that resolution happened. And it starts with a movie. In 1975, a film called Jaws was released in America. It became one of the biggest films ever made. There is a scene in the middle of it where a character named Quint, an old shark hunter, sits in a boat at night and talks about the Indianapolis. He describes being in the water. He describes the sharks. He describes waiting for a rescue that didn't come. Most people in the cinema had never heard of the Indianapolis. 20 years after Jaws, in 1996, a 12-year-old boy in South Carolina named Hunter Scott watched the film with his father. The Quint scene stopped him. He asked his father, "Was that real?" His father said yes. Hunter Scott started reading about it. What he found changed the direction of several years of his life. Hunter Scott turned the Indianapolis into a school history project. Then he went further. He wrote letters to members of Congress. He asked why McVeigh had never been formally cleared. He asked why a man who had survived 4 days in the water, who had been convicted on testimony that the actual enemy commander had contradicted under oath, was still officially guilty 50 years later. In 1999, Hunter Scott, then 15 years old, testified before the United States Congress about Charles McVeigh. Survivors of the Indianapolis sat behind him in the hearing room. In the year 2000, Congress passed a resolution formally clearing McVeigh's name. The Secretary of the Navy changed the official record. It took a 12-year-old watching a movie, writing letters for 3 years, and standing up in front of Congress to make it happen. McVeigh had been dead for 32 years. Here is what those 4 days cost, as simply as possible. Around 300 men died in the explosions, the fires, and the sinking. They were gone within 12 minutes. Around 580 more died in the water over the next 4 days. Shark attacks, drowning, thirst, salt water, heat, exhaustion, and the kind of slow breakdown that happens when a person has been holding on long enough that the body just stops. The men who died on day 3 and day 4, the ones lost in the last hours before Gwynn spotted them, most of them had held on that long. They died because they needed 1 more day, and rescue came on day 4. 1 more day. The official inquiry found 11 separate points where the system had failed. 11 moments where a different decision would have changed what happened. Not one of those 11 failures was McVeigh's. The inquiry recommended changes to how ships were tracked, how distress signals were handled, how night duty officers were held to account. Most of those changes were made. They were made after 880 men were dead. One of the 316 men pulled from the water on August 2nd, 1945, was Marine Edgar Harrell from Owensboro, Kentucky. He was 20 years old. He had joined the Marines at 18. He had been on the Indianapolis for months, standing watch, cleaning weapons, writing letters home. He was below decks when the torpedoes hit. He found a hatch in the dark, climbed through a ship that was already tilting badly, and went over the side as the front of the ship disappeared. He spent 4 days and 4 hours in the water. He did not drink salt water. He stayed with his group. He watched men die. He prayed. He was 19 pounds lighter when they pulled him out. He went home to Kentucky. He married. He had children and grandchildren. He wrote a book about the Indianapolis. He spent decades talking about what happened. At schools, at veterans' gatherings, at memorials, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He came back to this story again and again for more than 70 years because he felt that the 880 men who hadn't come home with him were owed at least that. He died in 2017 at the age of 92, one of the last surviving members of the Indianapolis crew. The men who found the survivors, Gwyn, who had been fixing a wire when he looked down, Marks, who landed his plane on the open ocean and tied men to the wings, Claytor, who aimed his searchlight at the sky. None of them were recognized in a way that matched what they had actually done. Gwyn said he didn't need it. He said he was just there. Harrell's family said that for the rest of his life, before he got into any water, a lake, a pool, a bathtub, he would stop and check the temperature with his hand. Not the air. The water. He never explained why. After 4.5 days in the Philippine Sea, he knew exactly what water felt like when it was keeping you alive. And he knew what it felt like when it was starting to take something from you instead. He checked the temperature. Every time. Until the end. 880 men who went into that water with him are still out there, in the place where a ship went down in 12 minutes, and the most powerful navy in the world took 4 days to notice it was gone.